Lesson 2, Sociological View of Self. George Herbert Mead proposed the theory of social self, or the social behaviorism. According to him, he argued that the self is not a biological but social. The self is developed as the person grows and ages. So habang lumalaki, nadidevelop yung self as we interact with others. The power of the environment in shaping human behavior is very important. Okay? The environment, kung sino yung mga nakakahalubilo natin. According to him, in addition, the self cannot be separated from the society. The self is a product of social interactions, internalizing the external views along with others' personal view about oneself. So, ang self daw ay nadidevelop based on our own impression of ourselves and at the same time from the impression of others. So, he believed that the self is not present at birth yet. Wala pang self. But the moment we interact with the environment, the moment we learn from our experience, we acquire knowledge and dealing with other, that's the time na di-develop yung self. Paano nadi-develop ang self? According to George Mead, there are 3 stages of development. The first is the preparatory or imitation or language stage. So dito, children's behavior is primarily based on imitation. So kapag ginagaya nila yung parents nila or kung sino man yung meron silang exposure, halimbawa sa internet or sa TV. Even the language, kung ano yung language na nakagisnan, yun yung natututunan. The second stage is the play stage. At this level, individuals role play or assumes the perspective of others. So, yung mga laro, katulad ng bahay-bahayan, nanay-nanayan, tatay-tatayan, it's not just a play, but it could bring something to these children, which is the sense of responsibility. Nakikita nila kung ano ang dapat na maging role ng isang tatay, ang role ng isang nanay, and yung perspective, halimbawa ng role bilang nanay ay nag-aalaga ng baby or naguhugas ng pinggan. So from there, nakikita nila kung ano yung mga ine-expect na behavior and possible din na ito yung ma-develop sa kanila. So the third stage is the game stage. He or she develops an understanding of how the other people feel about themselves in a variety of situations. So sa game, merong rule and one must abide by it to win the game or be successful at an activity. So itong game stage, it can also be applied even in later life. So possible naman na magsimula siya sa game na alam nila kung ano yung mga patakaran, kung ano yung mga dapat gawin at hindi dapat gawin. And their behavior to this respect may also be applied to their life in the future. Like for instance, merong rule sa eskwelahan, merong rule, let's say sa bahay, meron din. Sa society, meron din. So, itong rule na to, societal rule, okay, possible na ma-develop yung self based on how the individual deals with this rule. Susundin niya ba or hindi niya susundin? In addition to this game stage, the child has now the ability to respond not just to one but several members of his social environment. And at the same time, kapag ikaw ay nakikihalubilo sa iba't ibang member of the society, it could also be possible that you may develop yourself from their statement, from their impression. Itong batang to matalino. Itong batang to creative. Itong batang to ay tamad. Kaya ito yung sinasabi natin na in a sociological point of view, the self is developed from the views of others and from our own point of view of our self. According to George Mead, there are two sides of self, the I and me. So what's the difference between the I and me? I is a part of the self that is unsocialized and spontaneous, the individual's response to the community's attitude toward the person. Ito nandito yung mga impulses and drives, enables a person to express individualism and creativity, does not blindly follow rules. So sinasabi lang dito na yung I, hindi siya basta-basta sumusunod sa rule. Tinitignan niya muna kung gusto niyang sundin or ayaw niyang sundin. Why? Kasi sinusunod niya yung sarili niyang impulse or drive. Kaya ang sabi dito, it express individualism and creativity. Okay? So this is the unsocialized and spontaneous. You are showing yourself to others who you really are. I understand when to possibly bend or stretch the rule that governs social interactions. So, ibig sabihin nito, kahit nasa ang location tayo, halimbawa, nasa bahay, nasa school, nasa any place of the community, there are certain rules that we need to follow. But our I self analyze first, okay? Before they follow the rule. Kung gusto niya ba or ayaw niya. Kasi nasundin. Kasi nga, it could possibly bend or stretch the rule. Depende sa kanya because this I self represent the self as free and unique. Okay? Ini-express niya kung ano yung gusto niya, kung ano yung magiging decision niya because this is the subjective part of the self. So, pag sinabi nating subjective, nasa sa kanya yun, okay? Kung ano yung magiging reaction niya or kung paano yung magiging behavior niya in a certain situation. So, kung kailangang ipakita niya yung weaknesses niya, then that's it. So, kapag sinabi kasing objective, kung ano yung ine-expect ng society, dun lang nagpa-follow yung behavior natin. Me is the product of what the person has learned while interacting with others and with the environment. So yung me, ito yung tinatawag na social self. It results from the role-playing that we have experienced in the past when we are still young. Kapag naglalaro tayo halimbawa ng nanay-nanayan, bahay-bahayan, we learn to take the role of others. Nagkakaroon tayo ng perspective ng iba't ibang role which are expected by the society. So, ang me self, this is the self that function as an object. Kung ano yung ine-expect ng society, kung ano yung ine-expect ng family, kung ano yung ine-expect ng friend, yan yung nire-represent ng me. Me also represents the learned behavior, attitudes, and expectations of others in the society. When the person takes the role of the other and also represents the objective part of the self which we have already mentioned a while ago. So kung makikita natin dito sa picture, ang mga dentists, they look approachable. Why? Kasi yun ang supposedly na ine-expect natin na behavior sa kanila para hindi matakot yung mga bata na magpabunot ng ngipin. But in reality, of course, not all the time they are approachable. Kung sino talaga sila, yun yung I. Pero sometimes we behave nicely in dealing with others, yun naman yung me. Another concept under sociological view of self is the looking glass self by Charles Horton Cooley. It is a socio-psychological approach to understanding how society works. So, a person's self grows out of society's interpersonal interaction and the perception of others. Self is developed through the judgment of others. So, ibig sabihin, ang self ay nabubuo through our interpersonal interaction with others and by the judgment of others. Looking glass self refers to our own concept of the self, which is derived from seeing ourselves as others see us. So nabubuo yung konsepto natin sa ating sarili sa pamamagitan ng ating impression na ibinibigay sa iba kung ano yung tingin nila sa atin. So dito nabubuo yung self-fulfilling prophecy, the process by which people's expectations about a person lead them to elicit the behavior that confirms these expectations. Thus, the self fulfills the prophecy or expectations. So anong ibig sabihin nito? Self-fulfilling prophecy, kung ang ibang tao ay sinasabihan ka palagi, halimbawa na masipag, matalino, and that regularly happens, there is a possibility that time will come, maa-acquire mo yung ganong trait, pagiging masipag at matalino. And if that happens, the prophecy fulfills. Kaya tinatawag siya na self-fulfilling prophecy. So, in short, malaking value, may kinalaman yung mga statement nang gagaling sa ibang tao about us kasi doon nabubuo yung ating self. Now, the self-fulfilling prophecy has two types, the Galatea effect and the Pygmalion effect. Pag sinabing Galatea effect, sabi dito sa picture, I will do it because I know I can by yourself. Yung pep talk, a simple pep talk, sinasabihan mo yung sarili mo na kaya mo to until such time na kinaya mo talaga. While the Pygmalion effect, nanggagaling naman siya sa ibang tao. Kapag sinasabihan ka ng ibang tao ng mga negative, pag sinasabihan ka halimbawa ng ibang tao ng mga bad words, kahit hindi ka ganon, there is a tendency or chance na maging ganon ka kasi yun yung mga na-absorb mo na statement. So what is the lesson in this point? Siguro we have to be careful with our impression or statement towards others because they might absorb those statements, particularly kapag negative, which is unhealthy. So probably let's just appreciate, okay, or refrain from saying bad words to others because we may not be aware psychologically they could absorb those words or statements na sinasabi natin sa kanila. So, looking glass self, this is the view of oneself which comes from the personal qualities and impression of how others perceive the individual. So therefore, in looking glass self, it is shaped and reflected from the social world. So these reflected appraisals are internalized and become part of our self-concept which guides our future behavior. So tignan natin itong picture. Itong picture, kapag palagi siyang pinapagalitan, palagi siyang sinasabihan ng bad words, later on, it could have an impact to the self of the child. On the other hand naman, sa isang picture, kahit na ang reality ay isa siyang pusa, possible na malaking factor din the way what matters most is how you see yourself. Ayun. So ang ibig lang naman sabihin nito, we have to help ourselves to improve our self-esteem. Okay? May kinalaman siya sa pagbuo ng self or self-concept. These are other types of self based on sociological perspective. Meron tayong tinatawag na private self, public self, and collective self. Pag sinabi nating private self or individual self, ito yung pagkakilala natin sa sarili natin. An assessment of the self by the self, his or her attributes that differentiates her or him from others. Halimbawa, kilala mo yung sarili mo na creative, kilala mo yung sarili mo na matangkad or tall, and all of those things that you know about yourself, this represents your private or individual self. Ano naman ang public self? Ang public self naman ay mga impression ng ibang tao. Ano ba ang pagkakilala ng ibang tao sa'yo? It is an assessment of the self by the generalized other. Halimbawa, people think that I am religious. People think that I am corrupt. Okay, so those informations taken from others that represents the public self. Kung papaano ka tinitignan, what is the view of the public towards yourself. Now, the collective self is an assessment of the self by the membership in a social group. So dito, somewhat similar with the public self, kaso nga lang, yung characteristics or yung trait na nakikita nila sa'yo is based on your belongingness to a certain group. So halimbawa, member ka ng isang BTS, okay? So, in-expect na if you belong to that group, you are good in terms of dancing, you are good in terms of singing, okay? So, kung member ka of a particular group, may it be religious, may it be in the school organization, then you are expected to behave the same as other members behave. Okay, let's proceed to social identity. It is the person's sense of who he is according to his belongingness to a certain group. So, group membership, according to the social identity theory, is an important source of pride and self-esteem. It gives a sense of social identity, a sense of belongingness to the social world. Bakit ba tayo nakikigrupo? Bakit ba tayo sumasali sa barkada? Bakit ba tayo nakikiconnect sa ibang tao? It could be a source of pride. It could be a source of importance. Kasi alam mo na may kakampi ka. Kasi alam mo na may kasama ka. And there is a sense of connections, connectivity to other in which you could be influential. It could be a source of pride. So, malaking bagay din na you belong to a certain group kasi dun ka kumukuha ng tulong or dun ka kumukuha ng lakas ng loob in dealing with some situations in life. Now, if you already part of a certain group, meron tayong tinatawag na in-group or us and out-group or them. Pag sinabing in-group, you belong to that particular group, whatever category may it be. Pag sinabi namang out-group, hindi ka kasali dun sa grupo na yon. So, for instance, religion. Suppose you belong to Baptist. Lahat kayo ng member dun sa Baptist ay in-group. Kapag naman merong another religion, like for instance, the Roman Catholic, yun yung tinatawag na out-group kasi hindi naman ikaw belong or part of that group because you may have different ideology or doctrine. What are the three mental processes in evaluating us and them? First is social categorization. Categorizing people to understand and identify them. Katulad ng mga bagay na kinakategorize natin, halimbawa, living things and non-living things. Sa solid, iba yung liquid, iba yung gas, nakakategorize sila. Now, same thing with human being. Halimbawa, you belong to Christians or non-Christian. Your country belong to developed countries or third world countries. Maybe your group, you belong to part of DDS versus the other one is Dilawan, okay? So, ito yung tinatawag, yung pangalan ng grupo, ito yung tinatawag na social categorization. Next is social identification. Kanina, sa social categorization, inalam natin kung ano yung pangalan ng grupo. Dito naman sa social identification, inaalam na next yung identity ng grupo, adapting the identity of the group where they belong. So, if you are Christian, you adopt the attributes of being a Christian. You act in ways you believe the Christian act. So, another example, siguro kapag nasa grupo ka ng mga military, you are identified as brave. Okay, social identity as brave. The last is social comparison. After categorizing themselves as part of the group and they have identified with that group, they tend to compare now that group with the other groups. So they might begin to discriminate and criticize the other groups. So, ibig sabihin, nagsimula to sa pagbuo ng grupo, yung category ng grupo where you belong, tapos nagkaroon ng social identity, kung ano yung characteristics ng mga members of that group. The last one, possible na magkaroon ng social comparison. Yung social comparison, kino-compare mo na ngayon, yung grupo mo from the in-group to out-group, which may lead to criticize or discriminate the out-group. Social comparison theory is a process of comparing oneself with others in order to evaluate one's own abilities and opinions. Ito naman, ikaw sa sarili mo, when there is a tendency that you compare yourself to other, people's view of themselves are influenced by comparison they make of themselves with others. So, nabubuo yung pagkakilala natin sa ating sarili, the self, by comparing ourselves to others. The self is derived from the social comparison where our feelings, thoughts, and behavior are compared to others such that a social identity of self emerge. So, dito nga class, pwede nating i-example dito yung sa FB. Sometimes nakikita natin kung ano yung mga achievements sa FB ng ibang tao, and there is also a possibility that we may look up to them. Parang gusto natin, yung feelings natin, yung behavior natin, gusto rin nating makapunta sa ganong lugar. So, social comparison. There are two types of social comparison theory, the downward and the upward social comparison. The downward, and when we are trying to compare ourselves to others who are less fortunate than we are. Yung downward social comparison, kinukumpara natin yung sarili natin sa tao na mas mababa kesa sa atin. Halimbawa, less fortunate kesa sa atin. Halimbawa, kayo ay nag-aaral, sila ay hindi nag-aaral. So, kino-compare natin sa kanila. Halimbawa, ikaw ay matangkad, yung friend mo ay hindi katangkaran. So, that's a downward social comparison. So the purpose of downward social comparison is just to make ourselves feel better. Now, how about the upward social comparison? This is when we try to compare ourselves to others who are better than we are. Halimbawa, mas maganda kaysa sa atin, mas mayaman kaysa sa atin, mas malaki yung bahay kaysa sa atin. So, ito, to others, it could be a source of their inspiration. It could be a source of their motivation to achieve those things as well. But if we are to ask the psychologists, alin ba ang mas maganda? Downward or upward social comparison? The psychologists would say we are not supposed to compare ourselves to others. We should set our own standards. Pwede mong i-compare yung sarili mo sa'yo kung ano ka, sa sarili mo din, kung ano ka before at kung ano na yung na-achieve mo at present. Because if we will just keep on comparing ourselves to others, hindi siya makakatulong or hindi siya makakapagpa-healthy sa ating self-esteem.